I think unleashed means being courageous to take risks and know yourself so well that at times of taking those risks where you're absolutely scared, you can still take a 1% forward leap. An unleashing leader is still walking at a 1% difference every day, even when it's super scary
Mm-hmm.
and even when they know there's a lot at stake, they are still moving forward.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Welcome, everyone, to the Unleashing Leaders podcast. We are super excited to have as our guest today a practitioner and educator of leadership out there in the world making this happen. We are joined by Angela Marshalek. She is the Director of Training and Organizational Development for Bassett Mechanical, and they are based in Wisconsin with several stores and employees across those locations, providing incredible service to create customers for life. She is also a resilience coach and neuro mindfulness practitioner. So she also understands the science behind the practice of developing and unleashing leaders. And today we're going to be looking at that pivotal moment when leaders are under stress. We've been triggered, we've been activated, we've passed that threshold of the normal operating zone, and we're not really fully in our normal minds. And so how do we recognize when that happens? Because it will happen to all of us at some point. We just want to be able to expand that range. So looking at some practical tips for how we can all deal with that moment, because we have all been there and we will be there again. Angela, thanks for joining us on the show.
Great to be here, Lee. Thank you very much.
So my first question for you is, so many folks talk about self-awareness. And when I think of self-awareness, I'm imagining like a yoga studio or a monk meditative retreat. And I'm like, I'm Om, I'm Zen. And we all know that's not practical on a day-to-day basis. You know, leaders are operating in moments of crucibles of conflict and tension and challenge. And so it raises those stakes. So could you help us go into a deeper understanding of awareness when our style is under stress and why this is important?
Yes, definitely. I think what I want to do is, if it's okay with you, Lee, is just talk a little bit about style under stress first, and then pull in that piece of self-awareness, because I think all of us can start on a foundation and relate to our style under stress is when it goes all the way back to, the era of when we had seen like saber-toothed tigers. We have a tendency to move to fight, flight, or freeze. It's a perceived threat. And so I think as not just leaders, but all of us as human beings, we have this tendency when we get in these threat situations, we either respond very naturally to fight, flight, or freeze. So when we talk about style under stress, you really need to know your reaction to how you respond and what your triggers are that are moving you to either fight, flight, or freeze. So let's go back now to your question on self-awareness. My philosophy on self-awareness is I wish we could teach this in the grade schools. Creating a growth mindset in others is so important. And unfortunately, we don't always do that. And we reach an adult stage, and all of a sudden, a perceived threat takes over, and our style under stress kicks in unknowingly,
Game
and,
on.
and game on, and then we're there.
And I like your point, because the reality is this is an evolutionarily adaptive reality. Like having a style that shows up under a stress has its time and place, right? Like if there is legitimately a saber-tooth tiger, there's legitimately a bad person breaking in your house, right? Like
Right.
that's what it's there for. I think the key here is that like sometimes things that are less threatening
Right.
create the threshold that kicks us into that style. So tell us a little bit about what's some of the neuroscience behind it. Let's geek out a little bit on this.
Absolutely. So, just giving you a little neuroscience. So, when you see a perceived threat, your brain actually kicks in the cortisol and it hijacks your executive brain. We'll call that your prefrontal cortex. So, if you think about the palm of your hand and your thumb is your amygdala with all those emotions and it's tucked in with that prefrontal cortex, okay, I see a perceived threat. Guess what happens? You have all this cortisol that runs through the brain. It flips up and flips that executive brain, and it's gone. And all these emotions come out.
I've never heard that analogy said before about the amygdala there. And it is, it's like the size of an almond. But
Yeah.
you're right. It's like, okay, you're too slow is basically what it's saying, right? Because these higher order functions, they don't happen in nanoseconds. They take time to actually process. And our bodies and our brains are evolved to say, like, hey, it's better to freak out and investigate later than to have a higher order negotiation with that saber-toothed cat, because those
Mhm.
ancestors didn't make it. So that's
Right.
for here.
Right, right,
Um,
right, right.
so it says it's you're not in charge anymore. It's time for me to take over. So everybody has that. But I think what you really have learned is that everybody has a different way that that manifests, right? Like that's the common anatomical element. But how does it manifest in the phenotype or the behaviors of each
Mm.
individual?
Well, that great question. So I think when you think about how it manifests in adults, we've had 15, 20 years of patternistic behavior, of habits. We
Mm,
formed habits for years. And now, as adults, we're in a perceived threat. All of our good habits and our bad habits come with us with this perceived threat. And
mm,
so I think from that perspective is really getting a handle on your own self-awareness throughout early on, and it's a slow moving process. It's a lifelong process of learning about yourself, but I
mhm.
always look at the triggers. Let's talk triggers, because we
Okay.
can't have a conversation about style under stress or a conversation about the brain and self-awareness if we're not talking triggers, because what self-awareness is, let's watch our triggers.
Gotcha. Yeah, because that is the moment that matters. And I think everybody has different triggers. Like I might be walking along the street and I'm presented with several cues. And for me, they're in the comfort zone, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm familiar with that. I know what that is. No fight, flight, or freeze. And then for somebody else, it might be, okay, that's new. I'm nervous, but I still haven't quite been triggered yet. Like I'm paying attention to it more, but it's still, I think, below that threshold. Then there is the like, wow, right? Then it goes on from there. So being able to, so let's talk a little bit about that moment and what are some clues, maybe in retrospect, that you've actually crossed that threshold? And then how can one be able to decipher to be like, what was that thing that said, because it might not have been the thing that was in the foreground. It might have been something in the background and we weren't even aware of it. But that amygdala, man, she is a clever little lady. She's paying attention to everything.
And I want to say that that amygdala whispers
Mhm.
before it starts screaming. And so the concept of watching for the whispering is what becomes so crucial for us, because the body is connected to the mind, obviously, and all of it is tied together. Your heart starts to race. I've had leaders where their necks start getting red. I've had people shake. I've had people say, Angie, my right eye twitches under stress. And I said, you need to welcome all that. You guys welcome that, because it's your way and the body's way of saying something's coming that you need to prepare for. So I like to teach them about these atomic habits, so to speak, these little small habits that
Mhm.
whisper to us.
Yeah, yeah, and again, it's not that they're bad, they served us well. Maybe they got us out of a bad situation when we were in 7th grade, right? But, maybe we've outgrown them, and as adults, we might have more access to more resources and be able to respond in a more powerful way if we don't use the 7th grade version of that script, right? I like
Absolutely.
the biological clues are there. So what are some other clues where you look back and you're like, "Oh, yeah, definitely, I was literally not in my right mind. I was in my primitive mind." What are some other clues that somebody could learn to build on? Because it's one thing if it's just a one and done and you've never experienced it again, but as a leader, you're gonna be under stress a lot.
But
And so, it's you're gonna get a couple that build up. How can we build a library maybe of triggers where you're like, "You know what? I happen to know when this is going on, I'm more inclined or more vulnerable to that activation."
that library comes with talking about them. I know that sounds kind of cliche, but the truth of self awareness is talking about your habits and speaking out loud. Do I have patterns, right? Because patterns of behavior will repeat themselves.
Mhm.
And so when we start addressing and talking about our bad moments as much as our good moments, we start to see patterns in, I responded in this meeting, Angela, this way, but now I responded the same way yesterday when, let's say my leader said something that was defensive at me, or something that he threw at me that was evasive. So I said, look at the patterns. The patterns speak of fortunes, they tell you everything.
Well, you're in a great role where you get to be that internal change agent for a large organization. Tell us a little bit more about Bassett Mechanical and some of the cool things you guys are up to. And then let's swing back and see like how are you weaving this together in a very practical way for a distributed workforce who's doing manual field work on an ongoing basis, right?
So I came on board 2 years ago. Bassett is HVAC and refrigeration services. We also do field services, service techs, and we're moving fast. After COVID, Bassett has grown so much. In fact, we had some of our best years during the COVID years. And we have a very proactive leadership team here at Bassett. And so when they brought me in, they were very intentional about the reasons of why. They said, Angie, in my interview, the VP of HR said, we have two choices. I could bring in somebody that is new in your profession, somebody less inexperienced, or I could bring in somebody experienced that's going to move this organization very fast. We could either grow with this person or I need output fast.
Hmm.
So when she hired me, she said, the first thing we need to do is get the Leadership Academy up. Well, one of the things that I shared with her is the importance of coaching before getting into the academy. And we ground that coaching with a personality assessment that pulls out these hotspots, these areas of improvement, and these areas of awareness. And so we sit down for up to 5 hours with an individual here at Bassett before they get in the academy, and we set goals that become their professional development goals. So they know right away, hey,
Yeah.
this content helps me with my triggers. But the conversations lead that I have around adults when they have made bad decisions or they've had a bad day or something, they also get a journal and they journal it and they talk to me about it. And in those conversations, it's like us. We're having a campfire conversation around this. They're like, Ange, I see patterns. And
Mhm.
that's my job is to pull those patterns out of them and they can see it. Some of them say that it started when they were in grade school.
Sure, sure. Well, that's where a
So
lot of those base habits get formed for sure. By the way, kudos for you for so many folks like, hey, we want a leadership training. We think classroom is going to just make all this change. And I think it's an important part of leadership development. Don't get me wrong. I love it. I enjoy it. I think it can be very impactful. But I just, as an aside, I want to acknowledge you for blending in the coaching as well. Because if you're not creating intentional, personalized plans that they're going to use the training for, and they're not getting some dialogue in a way to be able to apply and incorporate it, you're barely going to get a return on investment of that. So really
absolutely.
kudos for that. I think all
Thank
the
you.
learning and development professionals out there are applauding right now. And all the budget officers are like, "Can I just pay for one day and be good?"
Right?
And I'm like, "You can, but then you won't get an ROI. So like then don't do it, right?" Um,
Exactly.
but if you are there maybe three patterns that you found are quite common, just some specific examples of like, hey, when this has happened and then this is stacked on top of it and then this has happened, like this is a common
Mhm.
pattern that you've seen across leaders. Give us three specific examples because I think for those empirical learners, they might really
Mhm.
benefit from hearing these.
Yeah, my first one actually was confirmed that today even, and I've seen this multiple times, and I told my participant, I go, I've seen this 100 times, is when you get really great employees in and they have a need for perfectionism. They have a tendency when they fail to awfulize. And so these automatic negative thoughts kick in and they call them ants. And these ants kick in and infest their head, and then the mind becomes dangerous. And so that is, I see that a lot in people and leaders that deal with perfectionism is they
Mhm,
have a tendency to awfulize when it's not that way. And then when they awfulize, the mind is teaching the brain to perform that way.
mhm,
And you can see that pattern right away. And sometimes I come right out. And when they give me examples of, I didn't do this well, and I'm like, and didn't do this well, I go, what did you do well?
mhm,
I go, is your mind dangerous? Are you thinking dangerously? And I think all of us, the brain is naturally geared towards negativity.
mhm,
It's not geared towards positivity. We have to teach people to have gratitude and speak joy.
mhm,
And Brene Brown is one of my biggest fans.
mhm.
So I resonate with her work because it's so hard to teach the brain to be positive when we're our own worst critics.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you mentioned that word ants. Say that one
Mhm.
more time what that was. And in this case, what would be the ant that that person was thinking when they were doing that awfulizing?
So basically, the ant is an automatic negative thought. And the ant that this individual had this morning was he had a tendency to personalize and
Mhm.
personalize in a negative way to the point where that impacted his behavior. And teaching them that you're actually teaching yourself to have bad behaviors through your mind. He was floored by that. He's like, I do have bad thoughts. I do think like that, and he's like,
How did you know?
right,
And you're
right,
like, look, it takes one to know one. Like we have
right,
them
right.
too,
We have them too. We have them too.
So the pattern there, if we can capture that, is somebody is, well-intended, striving for perfection, and then it's slightly less than. And then they immediately go to, I'm awful, I'm a terrible student, I'm no good at this, they never should have hired me. What were they thinking? This was a bad situation, this wasn't fair. Like those would all be examples of the ants. Am I getting
Yeah,
it right?
perfect. That's
Okay.
perfect. And then you're in this downward spiral roll, right?
Your state collapses and your energy implodes, and then you don't have access to the resources and the creativity and the possibilities to be able to then do something about it. And you're right. I think to your point, like, yeah, maybe there's a point where it's like you've got to hit rock bottoms for certain behaviors, right? We talk about like certain addictions, like you have to get to that rock bottom where you realize, no, this is really bad because you're in denial that it's not a problem. So in that case, maybe that's an adaptive thought, right? To help that person
Mhm.
realize I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. But I think to your point, it's that person where they're like they're working on an implementation. They're installing a water heater, which I just had a couple replaced, right? And they're putting the water heater, and the supervisor comes over and says, "Hey, good job. And next time, this flue here needs to go here so you don't get as much condensation, or maybe." And they're like, "It wasn't perfect." Oh, God, right? And they just collapse on the ground into the
Yes.
fetal position. And you're like, what happened? And then
Yeah.
that makes leaders scared to give feedback then, because then you don't want to crumple these fragile egos. But I think it's like, well, then how do you learn though?
It's not so bad when they start speaking. What's more difficult is when they go to silence
Mm,
under stress. So they
mhm.
get criticized and they don't question or they're not sure of why. And then they start awfulizing and then they start going down a path of, wow, I am that critique. I am that
Yeah.
flaw.
Yeah.
And then it just escalates to they become the flaw. And then their behaviors are all moving towards, I'm not worthy.
Yeah, yeah. And if you are the flaw, there's no room for growth. There's just like you're terminal. I think, Angela, some of that comes from some of the norms that we have in a lot of our educational institutions, from preschool all the way through university, where you start at 100%, and then as you make mistakes, you get docked, right? And if you don't have too many mistakes, you get a good grade. If you have too many mistakes, then maybe you barely pass. And if you have too many mistakes, you don't pass. And I think the only place in the world where that exists is in school. Like, and everywhere else, you start at zero. And as you do something right, you get some points. And
Right.
then you move up. So, what are some of the antidotes? If somebody was triggered by a criticism because they're in that perfectionist behavior and they're doing that awfulizing, what's something, if you were a leader and you saw that in somebody else, what could you do? And they went silent. I think that's a great clue you mentioned. What's something a leader could do, or what maybe you coach leaders to do to pull that person out?
Well, here at Bassett, we spend a lot of time coaching around giving constructive feedback.
Mhm,
And we spend a lot of time really drawing the leader into an empathetic situation of the employee. We
mhm,
spend a lot of time stepping in other shoes and trying to meet people where they're at. And so, one of our favorite lines around here is, let's meet people where they're at. The conversations we have is, tell us more about what you're seeing. If we're creating customers for life, we have to know what the story is behind the customer. So we spend a lot of time here at Bassett trying to really get the leader to say, tell me your story. And also, this is my story. And everybody's got a story, right? So I think from a leadership perspective, we respect that story when they're hired. We respect them all the way through their development. And we respect it even if we have to put somebody on a personal improvement plan. But we have to understand the story. And stories go back to that whole concept of the crucial conversation, right? There's a two-way path to action. I have an interest in the shared pool of understanding. What's your interest in that shared pool? And
yeah.
it's that dialogue, that two-way dialogue.
So, well, but you mentioned earlier about the silence. So, let's say that they went silent, and that's part of that crucial conversation model, right? To avoid the silence and violence. So, I know I've missed this clue. I mean, two of my kids definitely have this perfectionizing. They're the Hermiones from the Harry Potter worlds, right? If I get anything less than a flawless score, like they just implode. And I'm like, that is dangerous, right? Like, do not walk out of this house with that habit. But there were times where like I'm suggesting something or making an observation and they went silent. And in my mind, I'm thinking like, okay, they're just listening and internalizing. And it's like, nope, they are gone.
Yep. Yep.
They are, slashing and burning so much of themselves in that moment. So I don't know. Maybe this is just for me as a dad. What silence moment then to be like, oh, how do I call them back? And maybe I just need to pause and give it a moment and then try again. What would you recommend in those situations?
I think the most powerful question that I found with leaders when they go to silence is, what do you really want?
Mm,
We assume, which what assumptions do, right? We
mhm,
assume what everybody wants.
mhm.
And so I think when they go silent, do you really know where they're at or what they want?
No clue.
They have no, and what they're thinking. And so tell me what you want. And if they don't know what they want, okay, where are you at? Just tell me a little bit about your story. Where are you current state and where do you want to go? What
Mhm.
does this look like? We're so busy running and running and running. We lose sight of being in that present moment and
Yeah.
having these kind of
Mhm,
campfire
mhm,
conversations in this
mhm,
present moment. Like,
mhm.
how are you feeling in the now? And what are you thinking about at this moment?
Beautiful. Let's do one other example of a pattern that can result in a triggering having those ants, as you mentioned. So you talked about perfection. What's
Yeah.
another one that you commonly encounter?
I would say that being overly confident in your space.
Mm, mhm. Okay.
Sometimes if we have too much experience or we have too much knowledge on a subject, we get overly confident in a space and we just forget to listen. And so the pattern runs a little bit deeper than like an automatic negative thought. It runs into, am I listening?
Mm,
It goes into the concept of objective listening and active listening. And I don't know, I think as kids, we're not the best listeners. And then if we don't hone that skill, we
mhm,
continue as adults not to be
mhm.
good listeners. So nothing new there. But
No, no.
but I do think this whole concept of I've been in this space for a while and I'm comforted or I feel confident and comfortable, that kind of goes to that content. It does impede the listening
Mm,
because when you're content, what should I listen for? Or
gotcha.
if I'm content, what do I need to grow more? And so that becomes to me a barrier of growth.
Yeah. So this is more of like a what I would characterize, and this is probably not the correct technical term, a soft trigger,
Hmm.
right? Where in this case, you're present, you're out on a job site and you're looking things over, and you've got an apprentice with you. And the trigger is, I got this. I know everything there is to know about this. There's nothing new here. Right?
Mm.
Like, so
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
and then all of a sudden, like, your eyes say, "Well, if that's true, then I can turn off. I don't have to look for it, and I don't have to look at it through the eyes of the apprentice, and I don't have to look at it through the eyes of the customer. I'm so familiar with this, everything now is on automatic pilot," which is a very highly efficient state to be in,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it's a very risky state to be in because there are clues that are like going, "Wait a minute, that customer just raised their left eyebrow at you, which is telling you something's about to blow. This apprentice that you're with is looking at you being like, you're saying it looks great, but I can't tell you why. So I didn't learn anything from this experience. I walk out of there and my story is, I'm awesome. The
Yeah.
customer story is, you're an idiot. And the apprentice story is, I don't know
Yes.
why I'm here. And
Right.
and so, like, again, you part of you are awesome. It is true that you have 15 years of experience, and a lot of that was familiar with you, and that's to be celebrated. So I think in that case, it's a trigger that closes things down. And again, you start just going on automatic pilot. And I think that may seem like a kinder, gentler automatic pilot, but I think it's just as dangerous as an automatic pilot as I'm terrible, I'm worthless, and I'm no good. And
Absolutely. Because you're blind to the wake. You're blind to what's the cost? What
Mhm,
is the cost of me doing this? An example would be is if you have a dynamic salesperson and this dynamic salesperson has sold and sold and sold and sold hundreds and thousands of dollars for the organization. And then all of a sudden I turn around and there's a cost to the internal relationships or the process that's been broken multiple times along the way. Not healthy, not healthy for the organization, and not healthy for all the business partners that person works, nor the customer. But the truth of the matter is, he got it done,
Yeah. Yeah.
but there's a cost.
But at what
And
cost?
so,
Yeah.
right. And so that's what I always ask. My favorite question is yes, you got the result, but at what cost did you get
Mhm.
this result? And how many people are you impacting along the way that have to deal with your wake?
Yeah, yeah. And that cost, I think just like in finances, right? You can have a healthy investment or you can have a toxic investment where, like, hey, we grew, we bought this company, but we did it with leverage debt at really high interest rates and we can't recapitalize it. And all of a sudden you're like, that the cost of that purchase or that acquisition is going to be tremendous because of all the debt and the interest you're going to have to pay off. And I think relationships are like that too. Like you said, you got that great stellar salesperson, but yeah, they're bringing in the next client and they're bringing in the next deal or they're expanding an existing deal. But behind them is a wake of cultural toxicity and bruised and damaged relationships. And then you're like, okay, well, that's all debt that's going to have to get paid back plus interest,
Trust. Yeah.
and you're like, was that really, really worth it? I can very much relate to that scenario,
Well,
and I'm sure I've done it myself.
and I think too is it goes all the way back to our concept of the neuroscience piece of this, right?
Mhm,
Because subconsciously we are forming habits and we don't even know it and we're not aware of it. And
mhm,
so when we talk about self-awareness and you're talking about your behaviors on a daily basis, or I did this in the past and I see patterns, or I want to avoid this behavior in the future,
mm,
being top of mind with that conversation around my behaviors and habits is almost imperative so that subconsciously these bad habits don't become habitual and at a cost of others. And so sometimes people are like, I've been doing this for years. And I'm like, and it's been hurting people for years. And then they don't even aware, they're not even aware that subconsciously you have
mm,
habits formulating in every decisions, the
mhm,
decisions you make. And
mhm.
so it becomes a really great, rich campfire conversation around habits.
Yeah. Well, and I think the key too is
Oh,
like, let's not make ourselves bad and feel blame and shamed because we do
right.
this. It's like, dude, every leader in the world does this. You are not
Yes.
alone in having these habits. You are not the first person who
Yeah.
ever lost it at the handle based on this condition. So I think making it even safe to say that we're doing this. So with that, how can individuals become more self-aware of that style? And what are some strategies they can employ to adapt and manage it more effectively?
For all the OD leaders out there and development coaches and leaders that are running leadership programs, we do have peer-to-peer coaching also in our leadership academy.
Mhm.
So I would
Right.
highly
Yeah.
recommend that peer-to-peer coaching. And I'll throw out every month, talk to your peer coach about this behavior that you may see or may be a tendency to show up, or
Mhm.
even what are your rich behaviors and tendencies you can lean on when
Yeah.
you're under that kind of stress. And so I don't want to lose sight today of the conversation on to coach the ones that are have been serving people, right? We
Mhm.
have good
Mhm.
habits and bad habits, but to have those conversations about what are those habits that are forming under style under stress, but also what are the ones that are serving me. So
Yeah.
those peer
That's
coaching,
hard.
I get
Yep.
peer coaching is critical. Also 360s. I know people cringe when you hear the term 360, but if it's done well, you could ask a few quick questions to your cohort group
Mhm.
and also to, I call it my fictitious board of directors, right? I have my own fictitious board of directors.
I love
And,
this concept.
and so I throw out a question to them and throw an email out going, hey, I'm asking you, what do you think about this? How did I show up in this meeting yesterday? And so constantly asking some of those feedback questions, 360s is critical. And you can do that by yourself. You can
Yeah.
have your fictitious board and do it.
Mhm. Mhm. Excellent. No, that's one that you can totally bootstrap. No additional investment or resources required. And that might be a great place to start. But I think recognizing that it happens to all of us, knowing
Mhm.
when to look and say, yes, what are the patterns where I'm stressed out, where I rise above and I perform well and I stay present and I'm powerful and I'm purposeful? And then what are the patterns and conditions where maybe I'm more vulnerable and susceptible to triggering one of those ants? I love that little acronym there, or maybe going down an unhealthy spiral or just being blind to some of the evidence that's in front of us. And then what I heard also was then after that, then just paying attention and reflecting back and say, hey, over the last week or over the last month, where were some moments where I did that? And it's like, oh, and you know what? Okay, that one I took a greater hit before I started to go down that negative spiral, so, okay, I'm expanding my resilience. I'm raising my threshold, or you know what? It's starting to stack on me and I'm becoming even more sensitized to it. And now I'm piping off like the first
Mhm.
sign of it versus after 3 or 4 layers of it. So I am not moving in the right direction. I'm becoming
Right.
more conditioned. And maybe even people, I know this sounds kind of nefarious, but I think some people out there will start to learn your patterns and they will play them
Oh,
in a
absolutely.
manipulative way. They're like, hey, I know if I get you off center, then it
Yeah,
redirects attention from my own stuff. And that in and of itself is a negative behavior that they've learned to survive, right? Get a
absolutely.
diversion going. So I think it's imperative for us as leaders to start recognizing, like, oh, wait, maybe I'm being activated more because people have figured out that's my button.
Mhm, mhm. And I often give advice to some of our leaders that are more extroverted or boisterous or this, and I tell them, lay low for a while. It's okay to be in silence because the chaos then doesn't bubble up and it doesn't bubble up around you. It's okay to be okay in your own silence. And if you're unsure about what's going on, it will bubble up if it's not you because people do feed off that chaos for sure. For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, absolutely. It's not only for your self health and for the wellness and performance of those around you, it's also to be able to not be susceptible to maybe your detractors.
Mhm. And I just want to add too, just because I think this has been very effective for us at Bassett, is when we talk about these weekly check-ins, when I'm coaching or when others are working with each other peer to peer, I often have them weekly just say, drop an email and say, what went well and what are you going to work on?
Mhm,
So you stay in that now in the week, what went well this week and what am I going to work on? And
mhm.
they get in that pattern for over a year in the academy. And some of them have said, boy, Ange, what went well? And my ahas and my to dos and what went well and what didn't go so well kept me focused in the now in that week.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that really opens up to a whole new realm, which I know look, we talked about maybe having you back for another episode to go on a couple other topics, but this really is the bridge to mindfulness and resilience and even the deeper practices of like, true presence and acceptance. So you can powerfully deal with what's there, right? That every second we spend thinking, I wish it wouldn't have, or it shouldn't have, or it could have, a little bit of that might be helpful to do scenario planning for the next time, but too much of that, like there's no return on that versus like, yes, and this is what's happening right now. And so what am I going to do right now?
Mhm.
Because I don't have a time machine. I can't change the past. And worst case advising it or victimizing it or shoulda, coulda, woulda-nizing it. None of those are going to give you any purchase. So could we maybe wrap up with just a little bit on how does resilience readiness play a part in this? Because being a resilient leader doesn't mean you're tone deaf and you just blindly bluster ahead. But I think it means you can take some stress before I think you start to go into that other unproductive style.
Yeah, the definition of resiliency was with like Rocky, you get knocked down, you get back up again. You get knocked down, you get back up again. We don't teach that in resiliency anymore. The idea is to be like bamboo with snow on it. We want you to bend and
Mhm,
have intentional practices in place so
mhm.
that when you get hit, you don't fall, you just
Yeah,
bow back up again.
yeah.
And you got to be self aware enough to know your intentional practices.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.